I married a poor man on an impulse and became the laughingstock of my friends. At the class reunion, those who earned €25,000 a year sat at one table, and those who earned €250,000 sat at the other. My husband looked around the room, leaned close to my ear, and whispered with that quiet smile that I had learned to love so much. "And where is someone sitting who has 300 million? But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Clara Brenner, and I am 3 years old. In the small town where I grew up, 30 is the age when people stop asking a woman about her dreams and start asking her about her wedding date. I'm not unattractive. I run a small craft studio in one of the older Kotsteinplastergassen of the city, where I make and sell hand-embroidered textile art. It is honest work, silent work, and it is mine. But love has not been gracious with me. 5 years earlier, my first great love ended because his family decided that I was not enough, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not the right girl for their son's future. This rejection cut something out of me from the inside. After that, I built walls, high ones, but my biggest fear was never that I would be left alone. My greatest fear lived in my mother's eyes. Her name was Hild, and she had raised me alone after my father died when I was still at school. We shared an old apartment in a building that smelled of wood, polish, and old radiators, and we supported each other, just as two people do when there is no one else. She was everything to me. When her state of health began to deteriorate about 6 months ago, the dry cough began, which did not want to stop. The way the weight fell off her bones, the pale silence that replaced her usual vivacity, I talked myself into thinking it was exhaustion. I told myself it would pass. One evening I came home late from the studio, and she was sitting by the window in the dark, leaning against the armrest of her chair, as if she no longer had the strength to sit upright. I turned on the light. She smiled at me. It was the smile that something breaks in you before you even realize why. She told me to sit down. She grabbed my hand, and I just felt the bones in her fingers, cold as winter stone. Then she reached into the small drawer next to her chair and handed me a greased sheet of paper. She had gone to the clinic again without my knowledge. The results came from an oncology department. I didn't have to understand every medical term. 2 words were enough. Carcinoma. Un stadium. I couldn't breathe. The paper fell out of my hands. She wasn't crying. She looked at me with those silent eyes and said, "She's not afraid of dying. She is afraid to leave me alone." She told me that she asked our aunt to find someone, a decent man. She wanted to see me taken care of before she closed her eyes. She said it gently, but it was not a request. It was the last wish of a dying woman who had given me everything she had. And so I said yes. In tears, I said yes. What followed were 9 meetings arranged within a single week, and 9 disasters. A man who bounced with his real estate, a boy who still lived by his parents, a third who walked around my studio and laughed, calling my work decorative nonsense. After the 4th, I felt like merchandise at a sale. But every time I came home and saw my mother waiting for me with hope in her tired eyes, I couldn't bring myself to give up. The 10th meeting was on a Sunday in a small key called the Golden Afternoon. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at table 7 by the window, an A-lay book. He was wearing a plain white shirt and dark trousers. His hair was neatly cut, his face calm and striking in a way that belongs to men who think before they speak. He raised his eyes as I approached. His eyes were clear and still. His name was Jonas Weber. He was, as my aunt had told me, an ordinary office worker. He had lost his parents as a child. He lived alone in a rented room and drove to work on an old scooter. His monthly salary was just enough to live on. I sat down, I ordered ginger, and then, because I had no energy left to pretend, I put my identity card and my registration certificate on the table in front of him and told him the truth. All of it, my mother's diagnosis, the new meetings, my exhaustion, my despair. I told him I was not looking for wealth, passion, romance. I am looking for a kind man who is ready to stand next to me at a registry office so that my dying mother can see her daughter taken care of before she leaves this world. I watched his face while I was talking. He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He looked at me with something that I did not expect. Something that looked like recognition, as if my honesty had reached a part of him to which rarely anyone spoke. My phone rang before he could answer. It was my mother. Her voice was thin, interrupted by a cough. She asked how the meeting was going. And without fully understanding why, without giving Jonas a chance to agree or refuse, I heard myself say the words. He said yes. Mom, he agreed. There was silence at the other end, and then the faintest sigh that I had heard from her in 6 months. I hung up and looked at Jonas. I was shaking. I told him what I had done. I told him, I'm sorry. I gathered up my documents and got up to leave. And then he said, wait. He asked me if everything I had said to my mother was true. I told him, yes. He sat there silently for a moment. Then he said he would do it. He said that he too was being pushed to get married by people around him, and that my reason was at least honest. He said he was tired of dishonesty. He would rather build something real with a woman who has a sincere heart than with someone with high motives. We went to the registry office the same afternoon. He knew someone there who could also help on Sundays. We filled out the forms. We were standing in front of an official with a serious face and a rubber stamp, and we both said the word voluntarily when we were asked if we were doing this of our own free will. The stamp fell. The certificate was folded and handed over to us. We were married. That evening I took him home to meet my mother. When she saw the document in my hand and he standing behind me, she turned pale with incredulity, and then burst into quiet, grateful tears. She sat him down and held his hand and told him he was a good son. She insisted that we stay for dinner. She went to the market herself, coughing and laughing. And so our life together began. Jonas moved us into his rented room. It was small and simply a narrow bed, an old wardrobe, a gas cooker on a shelf. I hung up new curtains. I put flowers on the windowsill. I cooked with the money that he gave me every month, entrusted every euro of it to me without hesitation. He came home at the same hour every evening, ate everything on his plate, and rinsed the beer before I could speak again. He was a quiet man. He never brought me flowers. He never said nice things. But when I was sitting at my sewing kit until late at night, he appeared next to me with a cup of warm milk and a single phrase, "Your eyes need rest." When I pricked my finger with a needle, he came running up as if the house was on fire, pushed a plaster over the cut, and bled on it with a face that was so painful, as if he himself was the one who was bleeding. Every weekend we went to my mother with his old scooter. He always brought something with a bag of oranges, a carton of milk. He sat next to her and listened to her old stories without impatience. He repaired her broken fan without anyone asking him to. She loved him more than she loved me, she told me regularly and without apology. I didn't know when I started loving him. I think it happened the way water fills a vessel, so gradually that you don't notice it until the thing is full and you realize that it was overfilled all the time. One afternoon at an open-air craft market, a summer storm came without warning and tore my tent away. The rain fell in torrents. My silk cards and embroidered panels for months of work were exposed to the downpour. I tried to cover her with my own arms and body, crying and drenched when I heard him call my name. He had come directly from wherever he had been without a coat, already soaked. He pulled a heavy waterproof tarpaulin from somewhere and spread it over my work before he said a single word to me. He stood in the storm, holding the edges while the wind tried to tear them away. When the worst was over, he turned to me. He saw that I was shivering with cold. He took off his wet jacket and put it over my shoulders. "Forgive me gently. Why didn't you take shelter, you wayward woman?" And the concern in his voice was louder than his words. On the way home, I stopped holding the luggage carrier behind me. I wrapped my arms around his waist and held him tight. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, and we drove the rest of the way through the brightening sky like this. That night, I lay in the dark and understood what had happened to me. I had fallen in love with my husband. Then came the class reunion. The message appeared in a group chat of my old high school class party, organized by none other than Stefan Meyer, my former friend, to whom he had put his career above me, to whom his parents had come to my door to tell me that I was not suitable for their son's future. The chat was full of the usual noise: expensive cars, restaurant reservations. Someone mentioned Stefan's recent promotion to vice president of a financial firm. Stefan himself wrote that he is a happy single and maybe hopes to find an old flame again at the meeting. He told me he hadn't changed a bit. A former classmate tagged me and asked if I was still doing crafts if I had finally found a man. Jonas saw me staring at my phone with a face that I couldn't hide. He asked what was the matter. I showed it to him. He goes through it slowly and carefully. Then he looked at me. He asked, "Are you happy?" I told him, "Yes, completely." "Then you have nothing to prove to anyone," he said. "If you want to go, go." With a raised head, I left. I was wearing my best silk costume, the jade green one with the lotus embroidery that I had sewn on myself. I took the bus to save money, entered the shiny restaurant as if I had been there 100 times. The room was everything I expected. Glittering necklaces, discarded stock portfolios, designer shoes under the chairs of people who had sat one next to me in ordinary classrooms. Stefan arrived late in a navy suit with a golden watch, and the gravity of the room shifted towards him. He found me in the corner, looked at me from top to bottom and said, "I haven't changed at all. It wasn't a compliment." He sat down next to me. He lowered his voice. He said he made a mistake. He said he could give me everything now, the life I deserve, a villa, a car, no more penny cells in a rented room with some nobody office worker on a rusty scooter. Before I could speak, Jonas came in. He was wearing the white shirt that I had sewn for him. He was holding his old helmet in his hand. He stood in the entrance of this glittering room and looked exactly like what he seemed to be, a simple, ordinary man who had nothing to prove to anyone. And something happened in me. Any trace of lack of self-confidence dissolved. I got up, walked around the room and took the helmet out of his hands. I smiled so wide that I must have looked ridiculous. I didn't care. Stefan did not stop. He pushed on. He told Jonas directly to the face, told him that he was a failure who could not provide for a woman. A man with 2,000 euros and a broken scooter. A man who should step aside. I stepped in front of my husband. I'm not proud of the volume with which I spoke, but I meant every word. I told them that Jonas gave me all his money without hiding a dime, that he had walked through a rainstorm to protect my work, that he had sat next to my sick mother and held her hand and listened to her stories. I told them, his kindness is worth more than any record in this room. I told Stefan that his money could not buy. What did Jonas have? A sincere heart, an honest soul, and the kind of love that pitchness shows up in the thunderstorm. Then I took Jonas by the hand, and we went out. On the street, I apologized. I was afraid of having shamed him by making his situation so public. I was afraid he was angry. I started crying before I finished the sentence. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around me, pulled me to his chest, and held me there until I stopped shaking. When I finally looked up at him, his eyes were moist. My silent, steady, unshakable man was crying. He told me that all his life he was looking for someone who would say exactly these words. Not to impress someone, not for the crowd, but because she meant it that way. We drove home on the old scooter. I held him tightly the whole time, but that night, before we went upstairs, he paused. Something in his face was different, not the warmth from the restaurant, but something heavier. He said there was something he needed to tell me. He said he couldn't lie to me any longer, not after what I'd done tonight. His name was Jonas Weber. That was true. But he was not an office worker. He was not a man with a modest salary in rented rooms. The building we lived in, the scooter, the careful housekeeping. All this was a performance that he had built up on purpose, because every woman who had come before me had loved his money, not him. He had been scammed, used, ingratiated by people who wanted access to his accounts and connections. So he had stripped off everything to find out who would stay. A black car appeared at the end of the alley, a driver in uniform. The door opened. He was the chairman of the board of the White Group Real Estate, Finance, Healthcare, the private clinic where my mother had been re-examined, who had discovered that her diagnosis had been a catastrophic mistake of the original hospital that had given us back life. This clinic belonged to him. I wanted to be angry. It was a part of me too, I told him. I told his mother, the elegant woman who had visited us as a distant aunt and tested me with the jade bracelet, that I refused, that they had treated me like an experiment, like a specimen under glass. I was not wrong about that, and I said so too. But his mother spoke calmly. She told me how many women had come before me, how many had played affections while keeping an eye on his credit cards. She said that she stopped believing that it was possible to find someone who would see her son as a human being. And then I had turned up with my documents on a coffee table, my honest despair, my hand-sewn shirts and my tomato soup and my complete indifference to the impression I was making on someone. Jonas stopped me in the garden of this white villa and begged my pardon. He told me he didn't know when he fell in love with me, only that he did, and that it was the most real thing that had happened to me. I thought of my own deception, the marriage I had entered into not for love, but for a mother's dying wish.
We had both lied.
We had both hidden our real reasons in our own way, and out of all this dishonesty, something completely true had grown. I laughed through the last of my tears. I told him I had saved up to buy him a new scooter. He said he was keeping the old one. He is our memory. A year later, on a warm afternoon, I was sitting on the swing in the garden of this villa, knitting something very small.